something has gone very wrong in the last few years, and sadly, very few are on the right side of history. I can tell you, I'm one of them. I'm just so sorrowful and sad about what's happened to people through the pandemic. People have lost their lives, they've been injured, disabled, because of the failure to treat and the COVID-19 vaccines. Those two waves of damage to the population, I think it's going to be many decades before we sort this out and before there are real capitulation and reconciliation and forgiveness for this.
I think with anything, if somebody was to acknowledge a mistake in the past and come back to you and say, I'm sorry, I did make a mistake at the time, but here's my position going forward, that speaks volumes to me, as in it shows a level of humility, which when someone shows you humility, you automatically feel a lot more trust towards that person.
It's true. I mean, but look where we are. All of our major political figures around the world are not saying they're sorry or even admitting that the vaccine program was a mistake. So, from the top down, there is now a new normal, which is doubling down, quadrupling down. Our government agencies are saying, here, yet take another booster. That means, in the United States, it could be, 10 shots. Immunocompromised could be a dozen shots. Vaccines, COVID-19 vaccines, genetic vaccines given to 6-month-old children. It's on the CDC schedule. Can you imagine the reversal that's going to take place? And, there are some historical precedents for this. In the mid-19th century, when Semmelweis, a Vietnamese physician, discovered that doctors really need to wash their hands in order to reduce transmitting infections from patients to patients, doing pelvic exams, and he proved it. It took 20 years before the medical orthodoxy said, oh yeah, we were wrong and Semmelweis is right, we should wash our hands. 20 years. The same thing is true with smoking. It took 1949 when Rosenhill presented the data. It was clear that doctors smoking and nurses smoking, it was causing lung cancer in them, causing lung cancer in their patients. Doctors promoted smoking. It took 20 years before they said, oh yeah, we were wrong. We supported smoking. We are doing it ourselves. And now the opioid crisis, 20 years of this going on. And now the medical community is, oh yeah, we shouldn't be prescribing these highly addictive opioid drugs. So, it's a 20-year capitulation cycle. We're about 5 years into this. Now, the average doctor is not going out advertising these vaccines. There's no chief of medicine at any esteemed UK or US hospital that's out there saying the vaccines are good. They are just simply in the shadows, silent, knowing that something is going wrong and they don't know what to do.
Have you seen an uptick recently in more doctors advertising that the vaccines are a bad idea?
Very few. We're waiting for, a major chief of medicine, a major chief of infectious disease, another, to come out, or a CEO of a health system to come out. They just shamefully have dropped the vaccine mandates. They quietly just, don't mention actually either COVID-19 or the vaccine. There are no grand rounds on vaccine injuries, disabilities, and deaths, no major continuing medical education updates on it. The trend here is simply just not to mention them, just kind of to just forget they exist.
Yeah, then out of sight, out of mind, and then everyone will move on. What sort of feedback have you had on your research and your findings around the vaccine?
We find tremendous headwinds in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, I'm a former editor of 2 major journals. I've just been named an editor of a new cardiovascular journal. So I'm in the business of medical publication. I know what it takes. I'm one of the most highly published doctors in the world, most most frequently cited doctor in the area of heart and kidney medicine. Now I'm one of the most published doctors in COVID-19 since the pandemic on clinical issues, including how to treat the infection, vaccine safety. So I'm actually highly published on the big ticket issues. And I can tell you, based on the rates of rejection and censorship, retraction, even after full publication, my estimation is only 1% of the papers on early treatment and vaccine safety have actually gotten in. The vast majority are sitting out in a filing cabinet somewhere because they just can't penetrate this censorship. I mean, 1% of the papers on vaccine injuries being accepted. There's 4,000 papers describing horrendous vaccine syndromes, disabilities, death. And the number should be probably 400,000 papers.
With the pharmaceutical industry in general, and obviously you've discussed the opioids as well. And you did mention that's turning around now because it's had the 20-year cycle. What type of things lead you to believe it's turning around? Because I know the opioid crisis is really bad.
Well, it's front and center. Most states in the United States have mandatory, opioid safety and prescribing training in order to renew their licenses. I mean, there's a broad recognition. The entire health profession was, seduced into prescribing highly addictive opioids. And this is all chronicled. And, there's a movie, Dope Sick. And, a famous pharmaceutical company, Purdue Pharma, that used classic propaganda techniques. I'll never forget it. I was in practice and, we prescribed opioids occasionally, short term for painful syndromes. And then there started to be this big push. And believe it or not, it came from the nurses. And the nurses started new nursing practices where they assessed pain on every patient, even in non-painful syndromes. And then they would say pain is a fifth vital sign. And then there would be this report, doctor, you're not addressing the pain enough. And I felt pushed by nurses to prescribe opioids. It was coming all from the pharmaceutical industry through the nurses.
So were the nurses in direct contact with the pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, I think the pharmaceutical companies were holding various, educational events, marketing events, and there was no doubt about it. It was coming through nursing that we weren't addressing pain enough. And this pain as a fifth vital sign, we should look at the origins of that. We've been checking vital signs for centuries. Suddenly now this is a new nursing norm. And it literally just pushed doctors into prescribing opioids. I mean, we could be actually called for discipline if we weren't prescribing enough opioids. I mean, that's where the pressure came from. And so, I mean, that's what I recall. And, it wasn't like doctors like to do this and create patients to become narcotic addicts. It was coming through nursing.
So on a wider scale, how do you think the medical industry can move? From what I've read and what I've watched and everything I've listened to about the medical industry, it seems like the pharmaceutical companies have the medical industry under control. How do doctors move away from the pharmaceutical companies and move away from their sort of influences within the medical industry and just get down to what they should be doing and focusing on their patients' health?
Remember, it's a triangle between the industry, what we call the biopharmaceutical industry, and then the medical practicing community and the regulatory community. So it's a triangle. The first thing is we have to examine the pharmaceutical regulatory connection. And here in the United States now, the majority of revenue that comes into the regulatory agency comes from the pharmaceutical industry. We have 9 out of the 10 last FDA commissioners taking jobs in this biopharmaceutical complex or in venture capital firm. So many of these regulators are working for their next job in big pharma. This happened in the UK. You had a UK regulator who works for Moderna now. It's obvious that they were currying favor for industry. And so we need to stop that. There should be no industry dollars funding going to the regulators. We shouldn't have regulators holding patent rights on industry products. United States regulators hold patents on royalties on Moderna's vaccine. They can't be unbiased when they know money's going to be going to them. And we certainly can't have regulators working for their next job in pharmaceutical industries. We need to have non-compete. If regulators want to work as regulators, they need to sign non-compete so they will not go out and ultimately, or restrictive covenants is a better term. They should sign a restrictive covenant where they don't have to go out and, work for the regulator. So we have to start at that level. The second piece of this is we have to, and this all came out with the COVID-19 vaccines. I think that's where the giant problem was, is we have to disentangle this. That, for instance, we have the vaccine companies as well as the regulatory agencies making false claims. So the claims of a licensed product is in the package insert of the product. That's what's been demonstrated in the clinical trials, and that's what's agreed to by the regulatory agencies. So, for example, in the package insert for Pfizer and Moderna, under benefits, which is the smallest section of the package insert, there's only one benefit claimed, and it's past tense that the COVID-19 vaccines have been shown to reduce the risk of getting COVID-19 illness. Past tense. There's no future claim. There's no claim that the vaccines reduce severity of illness or hospitalization and death. No claim that they reduce transmission. And of course, there are warnings that the vaccines cause heart damage, blood clots, paralysis. So we have to get back to standard practice. We cannot have our US CDC or FDA or our vice president or president get out there and say the vaccines save your lives, or that the vaccines reduce your chances of giving the illness to your grandmother. Those are all false claims. Another one is the vaccines reduce the chances of getting long COVID. Our FDA commissioner has said that. So our FDA commissioner, our current one, Robert Califf, somebody who I know well, he's made a whole series of false claims. There's a vaccine promoter, Peter Hotez in Houston, Texas, who comes out, he currently makes vaccine false claims. Any doctor making false claims as a surrogate of the pharmaceutical industry should be subject to fines. You can't make false claims. So actually, believe it or not, our CDC and our FDA, which never should be making pharmaceutical claims, they have other roles. Our FDA should be regulating and particularly protecting Americans on drug safety. Our CDC should be doing outbreak analysis, data analytics, and in vitro diagnostics. None of those agencies should ever make a claim. They should never make a claim. And certainly Pfizer and Moderna can't go out there and advertise their product. In the United States, we allow TV advertising. They advertise their product and they don't disclose the safety risks.
And these people who are making these false claims out in the public, have you ever had a chance to speak to them sort of away from the public and behind closed doors, so to speak, to see what their actual opinions are on what they talk about?
Well, they're government employees. That means they work for me. I'm, American citizen. And so they've all been invited, the head of the FDA, CDC, NIH, NIAID director, they've all been invited to US Senate hearings, congressional hearings, and they don't show up. Wow. So no, I haven't had a chance to talk to them because they won't face me. And I've been the lead witness in US Senate testimony, co-moderator of major sessions. They're invited 90 days in advance. They're supposed to be there in the seats, and they're not. And right. So there's no communication. Never been an email. People, email them, call them. They don't respond. Do you know there's a vaccine injury group in the United States called React 19? It's led by Brianne Dressen. She arranged to have a meeting with the person in charge of the vaccine and related biological compounds for the FDA, Peter Marks, to have vaccine injured people actually talk to an FDA official, and they they paid their own money. They traveled to Washington. They waited to have this meeting, face-to-face meeting. That's what you're asking about. And then at the last minute, Peter Marks cancels it and said, well, I'll meet you on Zoom. So they had to find a conference room in the hotel to meet by Zoom, where they were probably just a few miles away in Washington. Wow. So no, our regulators will not meet with the public or with concerned doctors or scientists face-to-face.
Yeah, and this is the type of stuff, if they don't show up, it just doesn't get spoken about. And if they do show up, then there's material there for it to get spoken about more. So that's maybe why not.
So have you found issues in getting you being able to speak and you being censored over the past 4 years? And have you noticed that censorship starting to be a little bit more relaxed recently?
I'm pretty sure on the Meta platforms, my name alone gets censored. So if this podcast, for instance, you want to post it on YouTube or Facebook, probably my name alone, and artificial intelligence programs, our listening programs are being run quickly. Any term, COVID-19, vaccine, safety, false claims, things like this would immediately provoke censorship. So what we learned from the Supreme Court case, Missouri versus Biden, recent disclosures by Mark Zuckerberg, in charge of the Meta platforms, as well as the Twitter files, is that government agents are within our social media platforms, and they are censoring out any information to help people treat COVID-19 or help them get through a vaccine side effect. They're censoring out any information about vaccine adverse events or serious adverse events. And they're only doing one thing. They are manipulating social media to promote continued mass vaccination. This is very intentional. And it started with an open BBC campaign in December of 2020. It was simultaneous with the rollout of the first Pfizer vaccine, and it was called the Trusted News Initiative, which said it's going to crush any hope of treatment, any information on vaccine safety, and it's going to work to railroad mass vaccination on the population.
I think, is it America and one other country which it's legal to advertise, say, TV advertisements towards pharmaceutical goods? Do you know what the other country is? I forget.
It's New Zealand.
I think it's New Zealand. Yeah.
So it almost feels as if with that sort of mindset of let's advertise and make lots of money off pharmaceuticals, they've looked at the social media and thought there's an alternative way of advertising here, and that is to shut down anyone speaking about it and just having a select few voices, unless you're positively promoting the vaccine to get more sales. And not many people are aware of that, and it's quite a simple sort of strategy that they've taken. But majority of your average people aren't aware that that's taking place. Have you seen with your patients, do you see a lot of people that are confused with the situation on vaccines at the moment?
Yeah, a lot of people ask, like, why is the entire medical community in favor of vaccination and you're not? I mean, this idea of, why are you the outlier? So a lot of people just look at, where's the general flow and why is somebody going against the flow? And this is very important when it comes to drug safety. Let's take the issue of pregnant women taking the vaccine. Do you know there's about 36 peer-reviewed manuscripts that conclude the COVID-19 vaccines are safe in pregnancy? They conclude that. But do you know they are uniformly from doctors who are the authors who took the vaccine themselves, and they actually work at institutions that mandate the vaccines? I can tell you that how this works, doctors at your major institutions, when they have a peer-reviewed manuscript that's prepared, it actually has to be approved by the institution, the department chair, the research department. There's a sign-off. Can you imagine if the institution mandated the vaccines? They've been telling the patients the vaccines are safe and effective, and now there's a manuscript saying the vaccines cause a problem during pregnancy. There's no way that manuscript is getting out the door. There's no way. It's going to be killed even before submission. So if there's 30 papers saying the vaccines are safe and effective in pregnancy, but it has that level of bias, and there's one paper or two papers that have gotten out that describe, miscarriages, stillbirths, fetal and maternal hemorrhage, which one do you trust? The point is, you always trust the one paper. Don't trust the 30 papers where it's obvious the doctors are biased. And the typical approach would be, I've reviewed this on my Courageous Discourse Substack. And by the way, everybody listening can sign up for Courageous Discourse Substack. The emails are free every day. You get the graphical abstracts. So there was one of these 30 papers that concluded the vaccines were safe in pregnancy. And what they did is they followed what happened when women take the vaccine, and then they have their babies, and then what happens afterwards. But they very importantly excluded any women or babies who, when they had complications, went to another hospital. They said, well, we didn't get the information from the other hospital, so we have to exclude it. Well, let me tell you, if a woman has a baby and has a complication with that baby, they rarely return to the same hospital where the complication happened. They go to another one because they've, again, your opening question, they've lost their trust in the first hospital. So this differential in follow-up almost always explains the reason why they missed the safety issue. Another one is a very narrow window of time where they said, well, we only looked so many days after delivery or just what happened in the hospital. This lost to follow-up. So let's say a woman started at one hospital, but then, had a miscarriage at another hospital. Oh, well, no, we didn't capture that. We only captured miscarriages at our hospital. So there's just some obvious sources of bias that one could identify quickly and realize, wait a minute, we're getting a false signal here saying the vaccines are safe. We know the COVID-19 vaccines, the genetic vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, and AstraZeneca and Janssen, when they were on the market, they actually are the genetic code for the lethal spike protein. The spike protein is this. It's the spine on the surface of the virus. The spike protein was manufactured and engineered in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This spike protein gets into all the tissues. It's been demonstrated to get into the placenta and the blood going to the baby. It damages tissues. It causes blood clots and inflammation. In short, the spike protein's a killer. So this is a dangerous mechanism of action. Each vaccine, because the vials appear to be different, the batches appear to be different. Two papers, one by Schmeling and one by Manici, now clearly show that each shot is different in terms of its danger to the patient. And when the genetic code is installed, we don't know how much of this lethal spike protein will be produced in each patient, and each one's different. So that's the reason why some are harmed and others are not.
So once you've had the jab, and I've heard conflicting information on this, how long does the spike protein remain within your body?
The best study to quote is by Brogna and colleagues from Germany. They use mass spec, which is a meticulous technique to measure spike protein, the full-length Pfizer Moderna spike protein. By the way, the spike protein, this little spine on the surface of the virus, when it's produced by the vaccine, it twists into a rope of 3, so it trimerizes. And that's been found in the bloodstream in Pfizer Moderna patients for 6 months after they take the shot, circulating in the blood. Not in all of them, but at least half. And that's concerning to have a foreign, potentially lethal protein that was devised in a Chinese biosecurity lab literally floating in people's bloodstreams.
One thing that was definitely big during the actual when the pandemic was taking place was more and more people that stopped trusting the COVID-19 vaccine then stopped trusting all vaccines. Now, what's your opinion on that? Is that more dangerous than it should be, or do they have they got a point in not trusting more of the vaccines?
No, loss of trust is not dangerous because remember, loss of trust means that people don't take vaccines. And there's no danger in not taking a vaccine. So think about this. If one does not take a vaccine, it's impossible to have a side effect because they've never taken the shot, right? So if you never take the COVID shot, you never can get a COVID vaccine blood clot or myocarditis. I mean, so if the safe position is to not take a vaccine. Now, when you look at other vaccines, again, there are rare side effects, but they're real. So for instance, many people take influenza vaccines. Well, it's rare, but it's well described. They can cause Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a syndrome where one can be paralyzed, put on the mechanical ventilator, be damaged for life. If you never take an influenza vaccine, it's impossible to get influenza vaccine Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so, so the thinking there is the safe position is to not take a vaccine. And then we can always deal with the syndrome. If one gets influenza, people our age on this call, it's like a viral syndrome, a common cold. We have 4 antivirals that treat it. We can use secondary antibiotics. Let's say you never took a diphtheria or pertussis vaccine. It's not a big deal. I mean, we use azithromycin to treat it. So, if you never took the vaccine and if you happen to get it, we treat sore throats and colds all the time with azithromycin. It's not a big deal. So you can kind of work your way through the vaccines. Like, what if we never took the shingles vaccine? It's not a big deal. If you get shingles, we just use valacyclovir and prednisone, and we treat it. So, so none of the vaccines are sufficiently compelling at this point in time to say, wow, that, if we don't take them, that we're going to be harmed. It's all about risk and benefit.
Which is the exact same thing for the COVID vaccines, but because there were alternative types of medicine you could do to treat COVID when you had it. I think Joe Rogan was in trouble for that, and I saw that you featured there on his podcast, but he got in trouble for taking
ivermectin.
Ivermectin, yeah.
Yeah, there's dozens of studies now supporting the use of ivermectin and a ton of clinical experience. I was the first to publish on how to treat outpatient COVID-19. So from an academic and clinical perspective, I'm the most expert person in the world on this topic. And, by the end of 2020, a paper by Gougliakos and colleagues demonstrated we had clear and convincing evidence that multi-drug treatment was working. I've been most impressed with the nasal sprays and gargles. They work way better than ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine. Just using an iodine-based spray, a gargle, or xylitol-based, or sometimes they combine both products. They work great. Randomized trial by Baumforth and colleagues showed that the randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, I mean, this is high-quality evidence that a xylitol-based nasal spray protected against development of acute COVID-19 by over 70%. It was way better than a vaccine. And then nasal sprays and gargles have performed in 24 studies, including outpatient and inpatient studies. I've been very impressed with the data on vitamin D. Every single study shows that vitamin D not only is preventive, but in high doses therapeutic. We additionally use zinc and vitamin C and quercetin and over-the-counter product famotidine, all had good quality evidence. Then we got to the antivirals. People always wanted to focus on the antivirals, but we had a ton of things to do before the antivirals. And by the way, there are protocols that are very successful that use no antiviral. So hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, Paxlovid, molnupiravir, favipiravir, not needed. They're not needed. I don't want anybody to think here that it was necessary to take an antiviral. The viral replication phase wasn't that critical. It's really more about inflammation and blood clotting. But having said that, it was fine to use hydroxychloroquine, supported by over 400 studies, ivermectin, at least 6 studies. Paxlovid, fine to use Paxlovid. It had bigger government-funded studies. The same thing with molnupiravir. Didn't have a problem with any one of those. And we had ivermectin in the McCullough protocol by the end of 2020. I've used them all, unlike a lot of experts, and I see patients face to face. I don't see them over Zoom. I mean, I see them and examine them. So I may be one of the few people you've ever talked to that has directly examined a patient with COVID-19. And I can tell you, in my experience, using all the drugs, I think the drug that has the most immediate effect at the proper dose is ivermectin. There's no doubt about it. It's a very, very dynamic drug. And I would say the next most important drug is a steroid we use called prednisone. I would say that's number 2. And then, of course, we use about 4 to 6 drugs in combination. So early multi-drug therapy was essential to help patients avoid hospitalization and death. When you think about it, the other alternatives promoted by the government, masks, hand sanitizer, social distancing, lockdowns, vaccines, none of those are treatments. None of those are treatments. In fact, all the government offerings didn't help a sick patient at all. All they were doing is actually addressing well people. So when you think about it, the pandemic response was all focused on well people and was not appropriately directed towards those who were acutely sick with the illness.
Which some would say lock people up, give them time to create new illnesses, and then they can go back to the pharmaceuticals to get even more products. One thing that, go on.
This has always been a sort of something I've thought about and how to. So the food industry sell and promote ultra processed foods that in the long term make us sick, and then the pharmaceutical industries have a medicine to cure those sicknesses we get from ultra processed foods. Why is it so backwards? Why are we not looking to promote eating well, exercising daily, making sure you're hitting all your micronutrients and just living a nice, healthy, balanced life? And then instead we're advertised all this ultra processed food all the time. That just makes us sick in the long run anyway. Surely it's just promote healthy living, and then we'll spend less on pharmaceuticals.
This is a broad issue brought up by Robert F. Kennedy, who's a former presidential candidate, and he's the founder of the Children's Health Defense. Now he's aligned with former President Trump in his bid to be elected back for a second term. And so what you're talking about is what's called perverse incentives. And sadly, these industries are just following economic models. There are economic models about product creation and promotion, and sadly, they lead to adverse outcomes. You could say the same thing about the television and electronics industry. It's just leading to more sedentary behavior, and people are getting, more and more unfit over time. So this is all around us. Honestly, I think it's such a big, broad topic. It's going to be impossible to address in 4 years. But you certainly can outlaw things that are very harmful, like trans fats, which are supersaturated fats that every single analysis shows they're directly atherogenic, they're obesogenic, and cause heart disease. I think that would be fine. You can certainly ban COVID-19 vaccines. They clearly cause injuries, disabilities, and deaths, and they don't stop COVID. So I think the regulatory agencies could actually ban certain things that, would be helpful. But remember, people still have to make their choices. So one of the simple things to do is to provide food labels on everything. If you buy a Chick-fil-A, you should know how much sugar and starch and saturated fat is in it. There's kind of 3 bad things in foods: sugars, starch, and saturated fat, the 3 S's. Just put it on the food label so you know.
One thing they've done in the UK is at all restaurants now, they show you how many calories are in the food, which I think is quite like useful, and because it's something you would have ordered before, you look at it now and you think 1,000 calories are just in that food. So then you end up ordering something a little bit healthier.
It's true. Have you ever seen, like the United States, we have some very obesogenic restaurants. One of them is called Cheesecake Factory. And so if you order a piece of cheesecake, it's literally about a quarter of the pie. And, it could be a couple thousand calories.
Wow.
Now, if you ever go to the gym and really work out hard at one of these machines, you can never get past 300 calories burned. It's just, you can't. So the problem with food, though, is that people have to make their choices. And so you can only educate so much. And I think a lot of it's just kind of restrictive offerings. It's just, we'd have to say, listen, we're going to ban trans fats. So New York City years ago just banned trans fats. You'd have to do something like that, mandatory food labels. It sounds like you've done that in the UK. But otherwise, people are going to make their choices. And let's face it, making healthy food choices and allowing the body to be more hungry over time takes discipline.
Yeah.
And exercise takes discipline. And human beings, by their nature, are undisciplined. That's the problem. That's the reason why, it's only about 10% of us are holding a normal body weight, keeping our weight within, our age 18 body weight. Only 10%. 90% of people are advancing their weight during adulthood due to the lack of discipline.
Do you mentioned about New York banning trans fats. Did you say that was 4 years ago?
It was several years ago. I don't remember when it was done. One of you guys could probably search it, but yeah, they did. So you can make a McDonald's hamburger without trans fats. Yeah.
Are they seeing an impact in the sort of people's body weights over there, or in health in general?
One of the problems with government regulatory agencies, and this is true in the medicinal, food and agriculture, traffic safety, weather. One of the problems with all of these agencies is they come up with a good idea, like banning trans fats, but they don't measure outcomes. It's just like putting a new traffic light up or a stop sign. They don't measure the outcomes of doing that. Even major legislation that's passed, they don't measure the outcomes of it. That's the problem. And so, our government agencies have, in their processes, have so much to be, left to be desired.
And it's staying on the topic of food, going back to the vaccines. I know there's some talk about using mRNA vaccines in livestock. Have you done any research on how that will affect us eating these meats that have been from these animals that have been vaccinated with mRNA vaccines?
It's simply unknown at this point in time. I've summarized the literature on Courageous Discourse Substack. It is possible to get messenger RNA into food, whether it be, let's say, milk or into, fruit juice, what have you, and to get it absorbed in a mammalian GI tract. Now, how much of that messenger RNA actually finds its way into cells and it produces a form of immunization is unknown. But it's sufficiently worrisome because the messenger RNA, we don't know how long it lasts in the body. We don't know, all of its effects. We certainly don't know if it's, going to produce cancer later on. Messenger RNA has not gone through standard preclinical safety development for biodistribution, pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, teratogenicity, oncogenicity, genotoxicity. I mean, there are some major areas of preclinical safety testing that synthetic messenger RNA has not gone through, and it doesn't look like the regulatory agencies are going to require it because we've already had Pfizer and Moderna completely licensed. AstraZeneca and Janssen, temporarily were on the market, but now we have Moderna has a new influenza vaccine, respiratory syncytial vaccine. We hear about self-replicating avian influenza vaccines. There is a Merck product that's being used in pork right now, which is self-replicating genetic vaccination. It's being used in pork right now since 2017. We don't know the impact on those who eat the foods. To me, I'm much more worried about vegetables than I am meats, because the meats, are by and large not eaten raw. They're cooked and cured, and it's likely the genetic material is denatured. But in vegetables and fruit juice, what have you, it's a different story.
Mm. Yeah, sure.
So a self-replicating vaccine, how does that work?
Well, let's take the messenger RNA. If it is coded for a replication enzyme called a polymerase, then not only can the messenger RNA produce this protein product like the spike protein, but then it can actually direct the body to replicate it and produce another piece of messenger RNA. And so these self-replicating vaccines are moving along very quickly. In fact, Japan has already approved one for a COVID-19 vaccine that's self-replicating. Now, it's not in use right now, but this is alarming that, in a sense, you could take a vaccine and you'd have no way of shutting it off.
That sounds like a horror film. There's no tap to turn it off. Right, so shall we wrap this one up here?
Yep. All right. Yeah. Cheers, Peter. Dr. McCullough. It's been great having you on.
Well, thanks. Listen, I just want to put in a word on how to follow me. Go to my website, petermcculloughmd.com. That'll take you everywhere. Courageous Discourse, Substack, get on it, sign up. It's free. You get the newsletter every day. My podcast, America Out Loud Talk Radio, McCullough Report, and Pulse. Go to America Out Loud. You can ask questions and they'll be answered on the air. New topics every week coming out on the Apple iHeart podcast system. My book, Courage to Face COVID-19, Preventing Hospitalizations and Deaths While Battling the Biopharmaceutical Complex, and Amazon and on the website, couragetofacecovid.com. It's probably the best book in the entire COVID genre. The only one, by the way, that Amazon tried to ban. They tried to ban it for 12 days and we prevailed. So that tells you we're right over the target. Then on social media, I have the top doctor Twitter account of doctors who really see patients and are qualified specialists managing this. I'm number one in the world on Twitter. So make sure you get on my Twitter account, follow me. I'm on Getter, Truth Social, Telegram, LinkedIn. And let's spread the word. I mean, it's only through careful scholarship and research are we going to make progress. People have asked, listen, how can they financially support? Check out McCullough Foundation, McCulloughFND.org. United States, those are tax deductible donations. The foundation has been doing very well. We have our first clinical fellow who's been with us, and we're expanding. We have a big influence in investigative scholarship and prospective studies, the media, like I'm doing right now, in law. I've been an expert in dozens and dozens of cases that have been gone to the Supreme Court and the top courts in the world. And then finally in public policy. And I've had more experience in Washington as well as parliaments all over the world in shaping public policy. Something has gone very wrong in the last few years, and sadly, very few are on the right side of history. I can tell you, I'm one of them, and I don't regret a minute of what's happened over the last 4 years. And I'm just so sorrowful and sad about what's happened to people through the pandemic. People have lost their lives. They've been injured, disabled because of the failure to treat and the COVID-19 vaccines. Those two waves of damage to the population, I think it's going to be many decades before we sort this out and before there are real capitulation and reconciliation and forgiveness for this. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been
great. That was great. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.